لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. الله أكبر ولله الحمد. اللهم اجعل جمعنا هذا جمعا مرحوما واجعل تفرقنا من بعده تفرقا معصوما ولا تجعل فينا ولا منا شقيا ولا محروما. اللهم تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم. Welcome to lesson or session number 3 of Uloom al-Quran. If you're just joining us for the first time, ahla wa sahla. You're more than welcome to stay and attend. You don't have to be a credit student so that you can benefit, inshallah ta'ala, from learning about the Quran. This is the QR code, inshallah, for going forward for attendance. So if you are a credit student, please make sure you scan the QR code and enter your name so we can capture your attendance. Because for credit students, the attendance is part of your mark, inshallah. If you're an audit student, you don't have to worry about it. But if you're still thinking about it, we'll give you time, inshallah, to decide up to the the midterm. Of course, today we'll be having our first assignment. So kind of technically have to make a decision by maybe next week. But you can also do the assignment as an audit student if you just want feedback. You don't need to be a credit to do it, but I do encourage you, inshallah, to increase your self-accountability. Okay, so last week we covered Al-Quran. We talked about the various names of We talked about the various names of Al-Quran and the descriptions and how it describes itself. We talked also about what the difference is between Quran and Hadith. The screen is very clear. There we go. Jazakallah khair. And within that topic, we talked about also the difference between Quran and Hadith Qudsi. After that, we talked about Al-Wahi, which is translated as inspiration or a different form of revelation. I mean, it's all revelation, but there are different forms of it. We talked about how Wahi is communicated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to His creation. We then moved into a new topic that was addressing the stages of revelation of the Quran. We talked about there's 3 stages, if you remember. Then we talked about the topic of authenticity of the Quran. How do we know there's no tampering, right? Of course, this is when we talk about revelation, we're talking about from Al-Lawh al-Mahfuz, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in that process. We also talked about how that revelation of the Quran came down gradually, right? It came down gradually. We talked about the benefits and the importance of why that's the case, versus all in one shot. And we then also talked about what was the first and the last of the passages of the Quran to be revealed. Yes. Yeah. So what I'll do is maybe offline we'll talk to you because it's we can spend about 5-10 minutes on that topic again. The slides are there. Actually, there's a nice table that compares side by side. So I encourage you to look at the table, and then if you have questions, we can address them specifically. I'll answer specific questions, but to kind of just go back to a full topic, we just don't have the time, inshallah. Any questions on what we covered last week? Okay. Now there are assigned readings. Actually, they're not assigned, but they're supplementary readings from the text. So anybody who took an Arabic copy, it's also available online, or the English copy, which is available online. We don't have it physically. We will assign, inshallah, I'll send a note out that specifies which chapters to cover, but you can, I encourage you just to look even at the table of contents, and anything that we've covered so far, just have a quick read through it so that you can reinforce what you've learned, inshallah ta'ala. And if you have any questions after that, we can address them. Okay? All right. So, before we continue into a new topic, we're going to finish off the order of ayat or revelation. We talked about the very first part of the Quran that was revealed, We also talked about the last of the Quran that was revealed, whether it was an ayah or a surah. We covered that last week. This section talks about, within the same topic, within the same particular topic, there is also an order of ayat that's important to know. And I'll give you an example why it's important to know. This one in particular is with respect to the ayat of the Quran that deal with intoxicants, so namely alcohol. Now, it's important that our scholars have done so much work on this topic of order of Quran revealed. And why that's important? Because the knowledge of the chronology is essential. And it's essential because it enables scholars to understand and appreciate the history of the evolution of Islamic law. You can appreciate that evolution of Islamic law during the time of the Prophet ﷺ by knowing the order of ayat for a particular topic. Okay? And this also shows how much care the Sahaba and the Tabi'een and the scholars after them took care of the knowledge to preserve that knowledge of the Quran. Okay? And it gives you an appreciation of that. So if we look at the intoxicant example in the Quran, the first ayat to mention intoxicants are يسألونك عن الخمر والميسر قل فيهما إثم كبير ومنافع للناس وإثمهما أكبر من نفعهما. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, they ask you about intoxicants and gambling. Say to them, O Prophet of Allah, there is great evil in both, as well as some benefit for people, but the evil outweighs the benefit. So notice how the ayat of intoxicants, al-khamr, came. This is the first one that was revealed. And we know that because the scholars took the knowledge from going back to the Prophet ﷺ and made sure it's documented. So as you can see in this ayah, there's no prohibition of alcohol. Not yet. Simply stating that there's evil and there's benefit, but the evil outweighs the benefit. Right? Puts things in perspective. Now, the next ayah that came after that, that discussed alcohol or intoxicants, يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تقربوا الصلاة وأنتم سكارى حتى تعلموا ما تقولون ولا جنبا إلا عابري سبيل حتى تغتسلوا. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for the first part of this ayah, says, O you who believe, do not approach salah or prayer while intoxicated until you are aware of what you say. So you notice now, it's not don't approach it at all. Don't approach alcohol. Don't consume alcohol when you're going to pray. Right? Do not approach salah while you're drunk. So, okay, then that limits the timing of when it can be consumed. After salah, after Isha. So, you see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's shara came to make it easy on people to adjust, right? To adapt the Islamic law. And so, now it's limited only till Isha because I have prayers throughout the day. Fine, of course prayers are more important, so I will leave it till after. And then finally, the last ayat, or the last ayah with respect to intoxicants. I know maybe it's not very clear, I apologize. إنما يريد الشيطان أن يوقع بينكم العداوة والبغضاء في الخمر والميسر ويصدكم عن ذكر الله وعن الصلاة فهل أنتم منتهون. فهل أنتم منتهون. That it's Shaitan's plan is to stir up hostility and hatred. Hostility and hatred, nobody likes that, right? Between you with intoxicants and gambling, and to prevent you from remembering Allah and praying, so will you not abstain from these things. Now came the prohibition. Now it was easy for the Sahaba to let go of this cultural norm that people practiced. It went from, this is not very good for you, to limiting it, to prohibiting it. And so the order of ayat, the fact that it was documented, is important to be able to study how, and this is very applicable to us. How do you bring somebody from point A to point B? And this is very applicable in our time. When somebody becomes Muslim, you know, oh brother, you know, mashallah, it's great, all your sins are gone. And then, oh, by the way, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, and you can't do this. It's like, well, and then, subhanAllah, it just feels like so overwhelming. Imagine something imagine you've done these things that you do on a regular basis, and all of a sudden you enter a religion, and everybody tells you, you can't do any of this. That's hard. We have to put things in context. That's hard. So there's a wisdom that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us in prohibiting or bringing somebody from point A to point B, especially with halal and haram. And this is because of our scholars' efforts and diligence in making sure this knowledge is preserved. So there's a hikmah, and this is why this section pertains to Uloom al-Quran, of order of specific ayat that talk about a topic. Any questions on this? Okay, yes. No, this is just an example, but this is from a Shari'i perspective, yeah, of course, there's different. The Sahaba, when they got the order that alcohol is prohibited, and that was in Medina, not in Mecca, right? They were ready to basically take their bottle. They took their bottles and they threw them in the streets right away with no hesitation. I'm coming to you. So if they were asked to do this in Mecca, they wouldn't have left it. They even said that they wouldn't have left it. Now this is with alcohol. Other prohibitions, yes, and also in terms of da'wah. How do you perform da'wah? We'll talk about that in the next section to answer your question. Okay? So I'll give more examples, but this is why it's important to know the timing, which leads to our next topic. Makki versus Madani ayat. Okay? So when we talk about Makki versus Madani, it's important to know when the Quran was revealed, which ayat were revealed in which time. We'll talk about the breakdown of those times. What does it mean to be Makki versus Madani very shortly, inshallah. But to kind of give you context, the Meccan period was about how many years? We're talking about when the Prophet ﷺ received the message, all the way till Hijrah. How many years? More. More than 10. 13, right? 13 years Meccan, right? Then the Hijrah came, which is a turning point, a major turning point. Then the Madani period, which is 10 years. Don't worry. Yeah, I flipped it, don't worry. So, Quran, when it was revealed, it catered to the needs of Muslims, of Muslim society, or Muslims and society, both in Mecca and Medina. And that's why it's important. One of the first things you'll hear when you attend a tafsir dars or halaqah, and they start a new surah, or even throughout the tafsir class, is where was this revealed? The surah, is it Mecki or is it Madani? Because that's important context to know. Yes? 10 years. Oh, yeah, so Mecki is 13, and then Medina is 10 years. The Prophet ﷺ made hijrah about 53 years old, and then he passed away at 63. Okay? The Prophet ﷺ did not specifically remark whether an ayah was Mecki or Madani, by the way, right? Did he need to do that, alayhi salam? No, because it was being revealed in actual time, real time, right? So people knew, the Sahaba knew, this ayah just, these were revealed when we were in Mecca, and these are now revealed here, unless they were, joining Islam, late or after the time of the Prophet ﷺ, in which case the Sahaba told them, right? But the Prophet never commented on that because it was already given. They already knew, it was being revealed in real time. And the Sahaba knew the importance of this topic, and so they preserved this knowledge. Okay? So to differentiate between Mecki and Madani, it's essential to understand this because you have to understand the interpretation of the Quran from that lens. So what was different about Mecca and Medina? This is just two examples. When we talk about Muslims in Mecca versus Muslims in Medina, in Mecca, very few Muslims. And there was no government, right? They were just a group of individuals. In Medina, the majority of people in Medina were Muslim, and they established an Islamic state. There's a difference. They're completely different periods. for the believers. For the non-Muslims, in Mecca, you had basically addressing disbelievers of Quraysh, right? In Medina, it talked about the people of the book, because the people of the book inhabited Medina, mainly from the Jewish tradition, right? Bani Qurayza, Bani Qaynuqa', right? These were Jewish tribes. So you see how they're completely different contexts, and so that's why it's important to understand. And we'll see how that plays out, inshallah ta'ala. Now, Ibn Mas'ud, maybe I've mentioned this, that he mentioned, radiallahu anhu, that he said, I swear by Allah, beside whom there is no other God, there is no surah in the Quran except I knew where it was revealed. And there's not a single verse in the Quran except I knew the reason behind its revelation. If there were any person that knew more about the Quran than I did, it was possible for me to reach them, I would have got onto my camel and moved towards them to gain this knowledge. So you can see that the Sahaba were very careful to preserve this. Okay? Mecca versus Madani. All right. So what does it mean to be Mecca versus Madani? There are three classifications. The first one is based on time, and this is the strongest one. Okay? The strongest of the three is based on time. So if it was ayat revealed before Hijrah, then it would be considered as Mecca. If it was after Hijrah, it would be Madani. Okay? Now, this is the strongest of the three definitions. So even if you were, the Prophet ﷺ, when he went with the Sahaba to Mecca to perform Umrah, and he had ayat ﷺ revealed to him while he was away from Medina, but this was after Hijrah, right? Based on this definition, the ayat would be considered what? If he was in Mecca after Hijrah, receiving Quran. Madani, because it's based on time. It's after Hijrah. Okay? Yes? Yes, that's based on the first definition. The second definition is based on place, and it's the weaker one. So ayat that were revealed to the Prophet ﷺ in Mecca, were physically while he was in Mecca, that would be Mecca, versus physically in Medina, that would be Madani. And this is not as strong as or dominant as the first definition. Okay, but I'm giving you basically some of the differences of opinion, even if they're not as strong. Okay. When it comes to let's see here. Yeah, when it comes, so I'll talk about the topics maybe later. The third definition is based on who the ayat were addressing. So if the ayat are addressing Quraysh and the mushrikeen, right? One definition says that would be Mecca, because the Prophet ﷺ, those are the people he dealt with in the Mecca, while he was in Mecca. And if they were ayat addressing believers, Muslims specifically, Muslimin, or hypocrites, then it would be classified as Madani. But of course, it's like these definitions are not very comprehensive, because not all ayats talk about people, different types of people, right? But again, it's just another classification. But you can use the third one not to necessarily classify, but to understand that if you hear ayat about hypocrites, then you know it's likely going to be Madani. Okay? It probably is Madani, but it's not as comprehensive as the first definition. Why? Because there were no hypocrites in Mecca. Yes? Yeah, we'll talk about those details. Yeah, we'll talk about those details, inshallah. Okay? So why is it important to know the timing of the revelation? We kind of already discussed this. It's important to understand where the surahs, or the order which the surahs were revealed, because today we don't find that in the Mus'haf. The Mus'haf is, the order of surah and ayat is not the same as it was revealed. We talked about that before, right? We talked about how the Prophet ﷺ, through order from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, set the order in the Mus'haf that we find today. Why is it different? There are tafsir that go into why they are different, and there's some wisdom behind that. Now, the benefit of differentiating, we talked about to understand the history and progression of the Muslim community. Okay? So, the focus on Islamic beliefs or creed, basically aqidah, that was the primary subject of Meccan revelation. In Medina, the revelations focused on the laws of individuals, of the family, of the state. Okay? So, mainly focused on Tawheed in Mecca, and in Medina was rulings and laws. Okay? It's also important to identify between Mecca and Medina, Meccan and Madani ayat, because it gives you an understanding of the gradual development of the practices and the attitudes. So the Prophet ﷺ is told by Allah in Mecca to be patient when he's experiencing harm, when him and the Sahaba, him ﷺ and the Sahaba, were experiencing harm from the mushrikeen. While in Medina, he was told to beware of the plotting of people against him like the hypocrites. Okay? The Prophet ﷺ, how he dealt with different groups, depending on the period as well. So in Meccan period, how do we deal with them? Be patient. Have sabr. وَمَا صَبْرُكَ إِلَّا بِاللَّهِ. Right? Persevere through it. Allah is with you. Don't distress. Right? In Medina, it's fight back. Defend your deen. Different contexts. It's very important to identify both. Okay? And of course, we talked about the development of Islamic law, and I gave the example of alcohol and the commandment to fight. So there was no commandment to fight in Mecca. There was no state. There was no collective. The Muslims were very few. Right? In Medina, it was different. So this is why it's very important. And in Surah Al-Hajj, actually, the command to fight came after Hijrah. أذن للذين يقاتلون بأنهم ظلموا وإن الله على نصرهم لقدير. That it is there's permission given to those who are being fought, that they're being oppressed, that Allah for them to fight back. So this is to give you that the realization, or at least the main point. If the knowledge of where, when, and how an ayah was revealed, if that has been preserved, how is it possible then the actual meaning and the intent of the ayat not be preserved? Right? So it gives you, look at the detail to which our scholars have taken care to preserve this knowledge. Okay, so we kind of also a little bit talked about this topic. How do we know what is Makki versus Madani? You certainly should go to the tafsir, but you can tell by the style and the message of the ayat or the surah. Okay? The companions were present at the time of revelation, right? And they were the only eyewitnesses to the actual revelation process, and they were able to give us those reports. So that's how we know. You can tell, but the reports of because in Medina there were ayat addressing belief. There were. But that wasn't the dominant theme. Okay? So it's not like all ayat that are talking about the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the day of judgment are Makki. Predominantly they're Makki, but there are also some Madani. And so we know about those based on reports from the Sahaba. Okay? So if the report exists from companions stating the revelation was at this time in this place, this knowledge was taken as fact. Okay? And the second way we know is based on scholarly ijtihad or personal reasoning. And this is where they take into account the meaning of the ayah and the style of the ayah. And then for this, you may reject or accept the fact that it's Madani or Makki based on this classification. Not we, but other scholars can reject or accept. Right? And these two methods are not equivalent in acceptability. So let's go into the attributes. So how do you tell the difference of these Makki versus Madani? They talked about different needs. So the state of the believers before Hijrah, Islam was a new religion, and beliefs need to be established. And Muslims were oppressed and they had little power, so they needed continual moral support that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given them. So you see that was the state of the believers before. And then after Hijrah, they had their own state. They were in need of divine guidance to guide their daily and social lives. And they needed to know how to conduct fighting. How do you fight back? How do you engage in jihad? And how do you interact with other non-Muslims? Right? How do you interact? And so the needs varied of the believers based on the time and situation. Some of the common themes of Makki surah, so now we're talking about Makki, ayat or surah, the call to worshipping Allah alone. Okay? The establishment of the belief system, the prophethood, angels, and previous scriptures, and the Day of Judgment, accountability, and previous stories of prophets. Prophets where they were sent to people and the people were destroyed. Not necessarily Sayyidina Musa, right? Because Sayyidina Musa, a lot of the stories, he, alayhi salam, was guiding people who had commandments and revelation to abide by. They had their own shara. They had their own laws and rules set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when it talks about Sayyidina Musa in the Quran, this is not 100%, but there's a significant amount of the ayat that address Sayyidina Musa's story. They're talking about Bani Israel and how Bani Israel were a society and they had their rules and they broke those rules. For us to learn from that so we don't repeat the same thing. So it did come at a time when rules were being revealed to the believers as a way of comparison. Right? And so those addressed. So to answer your question, depends on the prophets, but when you talk about Sayyidina Hud and Salih, Sayyidina Yusuf, alayhi salam, those came in the Meccan period for the most part. Okay? So stories of previous generations, morality and good conduct on a broad basis. Right? For example, the Arabs addressing the Arabs for ayat regarding female infanticide that they used to do certain things, whether it's zina, whether it's they're killing their own children, whether it's murder, those general, it's not necessarily something new that is revealed as a law that you have to now. It's inherent. It's morality, right? These were Makki. You didn't need to wait for Medina to say you shouldn't be doing these things, shouldn't be stealing, right? Now, the laws and the repercussions of that, right? In general, those are different periods. For Madani, the themes are perfection of ritual worship. So detailed laws of prayer, charity, fasting was prescribed in Medina, right? Ramadan fasting is Medina. Pilgrimage, the establishment of the laws, system of laws that governs the individual, the society, the family, those relationships. The dialogue, how do you address Jews and Christians and people of other faiths, right? Not just believers, but people of other faiths. Okay? So with laws, we talked about laws of jihad, laws of marriage, inheritance, and their specific hudud or punishments for things that you shouldn't be doing. The dialogue between Christians and Jews, true teachings of Sayyidina Musa and Isa, right? Those were revealed in Medina. The history of the children of Bani Israel, how Allah dealt with them when they were when they were treacherous or disobeyed. Those are in Medina. The exposition of the plots of the hypocrites. So hypocrites only existed in Medina, not in Mecca. Why? Yes. So not because of other religions. Yes.
Because the dominant culture in Medina was Islamic, so the non-believers had to abide by that, so they didn't need to abide by Islamic culture in Mecca.
Yeah, you're getting to the point. So the point is, in Mecca, there was no benefit to being a Muslim. You were persecuted. So hypocrisy is claiming belief, but inside you don't. Right? You could care less. Right? So you claim I'm a believer, but deep down inside you're rejecting it. Right? And there are signs to hypocrisy that the Prophet taught us. But in Mecca, there was no benefit to say, hey, I'm Muslim, and you don't believe it, because you would have been punished. Why would you put yourself through that if you didn't believe? In Medina, right, sorry, what's your name? Adam. As Adam mentioned, there is now a society. So there is now, the majority of society is Muslim. And so if you weren't Muslim, you stood out. And so there were benefits to being a Muslim, social, and societal benefits. And so to gain those benefits, you would claim that you're a believer if you didn't believe, and you would hide your disbelief. So there were hypocrites in Medina, but not in Mecca. And that's why the ayat that address hypocrites. So when somebody tells you Surah Al-Munafiqun, where was it revealed? I don't think you really necessarily need to go to a tafsir to know, right? Right? You would know simply by the fact that it's addressing hypocrisy. Okay? All right. So we talked about the social and political advantages of being a Muslim in Medina, and so it led to a new breed of people that professed belief, but they were just pretenders, and those are the hypocrites. All right, what about characteristics? So we talked about the topics or themes. What about the characteristics of Meccan revelation? Well, if you look at Meccan surah, every surah that has an oath, or where it says kalla, this oath only occurs in kind of the last half of Quran, in about 15 surah. Those are Makki. Right? So can somebody give me a surah where it says kalla? Yes. Go ahead. Okay, very good. Very good. You're going to say one. You said it? Give me another one. Yep, very good. That's good. I'm not going to put you on the spot. Jazakallah khair. You took it from him. But there's about 15 or so surah. Another characteristic of Meccan is surah that start with disjointed letters, right? Al-Muqatta'at. So Alif Lam Mim, Ha Mim, Alif Lam Ra, right? Those are Mecci, there's exceptions, of course. And the exceptions in this case are Al-Baqarah and Ali Imran. They start with Alif Lam Mim, but they are actually Madani. Okay? Actually, most of the longest surah of the Quran, the Sab'a Tawal, the 7 long ones, are Madani. Right? Actually, there's only one Mecci. Does anyone know which of the 7 long ones is Mecci? Yeah. Araf, so actually, maybe, hold on. So it's, Araf I have to see, because there may be, I have to double check that, because so by the way, this is one thing to mention. The longer surah, they could consist of ayat revealed in one period, and both periods basically, but one period dominates. Okay? The shorter surah were revealed all in one shot. Okay? So Surah Al-Ikhlas, Surah Al-Takathur, those, because they're short, they all came in one. Right? Surah Al-Alaq is exception also, right? Because we know that the first 5 ayat were revealed to the Prophet. Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, right? The longer surah, not necessarily all in the same period. Remember, the compilation of the Quran, putting the ayat in specific order that we find today, was set after, right? This is not how it was revealed in that order. So I have to check Al-Araf. I don't remember now. It's kind of forgetting. But An'am. An'am is Makki, and Surah Al-An'am's theme is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It talks about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? Surahs that contain stories of previous prophets, specific, older generations, previous generations that disobeyed. Story of Sayyidina Adam and the creation, those are Makki, with the exception again of Baqarah. That's why there's exceptions, and that's why you have to make sure. Generally, Meccan ayat are short. Okay, the short ones, you can tell that they're mainly Makki, and they use very strong words, or actually, I guess I want to say infrequently used words by just the masses or the public. And there's a lot of oaths. So when Allah takes an oath, right? وَالسَّمَاءِ وَالطَّارِقِ وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَى وَالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا, etc. Those are Makki, for the most part. For Madani, ayat that mention a punishment for a crime or hudud. Surahs that mention hypocrites, we talked about that. By the way, there is one exception to that. Surah Al-Ankabut. There's actually a difference of opinion if it's predominantly Makki or Madani, Surah Al-Ankabut, right? And this is why I say some of the surahs revealed in Mecca, some in Medina time, right? Surahs that address Jews and Christians, we talked about that. Jihad and ayat that are Madani are longer than Makki ayat in style, okay? In style. Any questions so far? Am I moving too slow, too fast, or just right? So be honest with me, because I don't want to put you to sleep, and I don't want you to be confused. So hands up for too fast. Hands up for too slow. Be honest. Okay, hands up for just right. Okay, Jazakumullah khair. Yes.
I just had a question. I thought that class starts at 9, but we came in at 8:45.
It's after Isha. So I think they changed the poster. The poster should say after Isha. Did you see 9 somewhere else? It does? SubhanAllah. I've told them specifically, I didn't see the final product. When they sent me the poster, it said 9. I said, please make it after Isha, because it's late already. So at least if we start after Isha, it's getting earlier. We don't have to finish at 10. We can finish at 9:30. So I do apologize for that. That's something that has to be fixed right away. The recording, are you guys credit students? So the recording is available for you, inshallah, as well as the slides. So please, take some time to just to listen to the 15, 20 minutes that you missed. And I do apologize. It's right after Isha, inshallah. Okay. Here is the surahs, or the surah, according to Zarkashi. There are 85. Again, there's differences of opinion on the number, on which ones are what. Some of them are clear, some of them are, again, difference of opinion. About 85 surah are Makki, but those 85, by the way, how many surah are in the Quran? 114. 85 of those, again, according to the Zarkashi, are Makki, but those constitute only about a third of the Quran in terms of length. So about 11 ajza. Remember, we said Makki are shorter ayat, right? The shorter surahs. So Juz' Amma, all but 2, according to some scholars, are Makki. All but 2 are Makki, right? Here are the list of the surahs. Please take time to memorize those numbers. No, I'm just kidding. It's a joke. It's just a joke. No, when you learn tafsir, you should learn about whether the surah is Makki or Madani. Right? It's important to know the context. But again, I just put this here in the notes so that if you're interested, again, this is one based on Zarkashi's work. There may be differences of opinion amongst those. The Madani ones, which were revealed after Hijrah, again, remember we're using the definition of before and after Hijrah here, right? According to Zarkashi, the balance of what's left, so that's 29 surahs. But those 29, because those are the longest surahs, the longest ayat, they make up about 19 ajza, so about 2/3. Yes?
You mentioned that most, if not all, of the Mecca surahs were revealed in their entirety at once.
Yeah, the shorter ones.
The shorter ones.
Yes.
Whereas the Medini ones were not revealed in their entirety. Is there a reason for that? That you have some surahs that are revealed in their entirety and some that are
So I don't. So the so my the, I don't think this answers your question, but the surahs that are short, they're to the point. They're very. They're basically came with a specific concept that was delivered without necessarily any elaboration or any explanation. So it came all in one shot. Versus ones where it came and over time there was analogies or stories to support or similes. Those came over time. And by the way, again, that's for the shorter, right? The longer Mekki surah also did not come in one shot. Yeah. Yes. Sorry, the Mekki? The short Madani ones, yeah. So the short Madani ones, like I mentioned, there's a couple in Juz Amma, for example, Surah Al-Bayyinah. I believe Surah Al-Bayyinah came all in one shot. I'd have to double check. I'm not 100% sure, but my memory just skips me. But again, it's based on length, not so much as that period of time. Wallahu a'lam. Okay. All right. There are a difference of opinion here. I mentioned them in the notes. So Surah Al-Nas, Al-Falaq, Al-Zalzala. Again, there's also strength of opinion. So some scholars may, majority scholars say they're Mekki versus Madani or vice versa. But this is based on Zarkashi's work. Okay? That's why it's good to look at different texts and where that evidence comes from. But this gives you an idea, inshallah ta'ala. Okay? All right. Like I mentioned, many surahs do contain material from both periods of revelation. And in some cases, there are differences of scholarly opinion between the classification of the ayat, not just the surah, but the ayat. On the whole, it is well-established distinction, though. So it's, again, part of the science of tafsir, and it's derived from internal evidence of the text and of the Quran itself, and reports from the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba. Okay? So, for example, Surah Yusuf. We know that it came after the Prophet ﷺ was going through a hard time to give him ﷺ hope and glad tidings that this is what happened to Yusuf ﷺ, and this is what happened at the end, right? And this came in Mecca, after the Prophet ﷺ's Khadija radiallahu anha passed away, his uncle passed away, he went to Ta'if, they rejected him, Mecca didn't want him back. So you see how a lot of difficulty, and so it came for that context. All right, so here's just a summary. When you read a surah, use the following criteria as guidance, and guidance only. It's not 100% foolproof. When you talk about the theme, if it's focusing on the Day of Judgment, Tawheed, patience, past prophets and their nations, Mekki in general, rulings, laws, fighting, etc., Madani. When it references Abu Lahab was at a time of Mecca, it was Mekki. The Battle of Badr, the Battle of the Trench, Khandaq, those are Madani, because it happens during the Medina period, right? We talked about the length, the shorter ayat versus longer ayat. It's actually interesting because you look at, for example, Surah Al-Anfal, which talks about fighting, is Madani. The ayat are longer, versus Shu'ara, which are very short, right? كذبت عاد المرسلين إذ قال لهم أخوهم هود ألا تتقون إني لكم رسول أمين فاتقوا الله وأطيعون, right? Very short, and they've got a specific rhythm and style. Okay. Again, who it addresses? O mankind, Ya ayyuhan nas, Ya bani Adam. Those are mainly Mekki. Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, Ya ahl al-kitab, O people, O believers, O people of the book. That's mainly Madani. The disjointed letters we talked about, and there is, by the way, Quran revealed during Hijrah. Okay? All right. Is this enough for this topic? It's during Hijrah. It's still part of it's during the Hijrah of the Prophet. It's during Hijrah. So it will say these ayat are during Hijrah. Right? Yes?
Do we know what those ayat are?
There are, yeah, so this is, actually I think I have it here. For example, the end of Surah Al-Qasas, إِنَّ الَّذِي فَرَضَ عَلَيْكَ الْقُرْآنَ لَرَادُّكَ إِلَى مَعَادٍ. Most certainly the one who has ordained the Quran for you will bring you back home. رَادُّكَ إِلَى مَعَادٍ. Allah is talking to the Prophet ﷺ who left his home, that one day you are coming back to your home. Okay? It's a glad tidings. It's to give the Prophet ﷺ some comfort. Right? And that was, according to scholars, during Hijrah. Is that good? Yes. It's during Hijrah. Yeah, it's during Hijrah. Why if it doesn't fit in this or this, it's in the transition phase. So we have documentation and opinions that it's during this transition, and it's important to know that it's during transition. So for example, this ayah, which is not very clear, I do apologize, it should be clear in the PDF online, is to show you how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was looking after the Prophet ﷺ. He's giving him comfort. This was extremely difficult journey, number one. Number two is leaving everything behind, right? Going to a brand new place. I don't know if any of you have moved from one country to Canada. It's maybe if you're younger, you didn't feel the stress. Okay, if you're older, maybe you felt it, right? But it's not easy in the base case. Yes. Alif Lam Ra, Alif Lam Mim. So the letters that are read this way, they're not read Alam or Ham or Surah 2 and 3. Baqarah and Ali Imran, they start with Alif Lam Mim. This is maybe the part that you missed in the beginning of the class. I do apologize. Surah Al-Baqarah and Ali Imran are Madani surahs, but they start with Alif Lam Mim. Okay? All right, so let's move on to a new topic, and that is now the transmission of the Quran. So we talked about the revelation of the Quran. That's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala all the way to Muhammad alayhi salatu. Now, how was it transmitted from the Prophet ﷺ to us? To us. So this is a fairly long topic. We're not going to cover all of it today by any means. We may take today, a little bit today, inshallah, certainly all of next week and maybe even the week after. But we will walk through the journey, inshallah ta'ala, from the Prophet ﷺ all the way to how the masahif today look like and everything in between. Just so you can appreciate the care that the Sahaba, the Tabi'een, and everybody after them came and dedicated to the Quran. And we actually literally received the Quran on a gold platter. Right? It's like there for us. Like we take it so granted, like crazy. It's just like, well, it's sitting on the shelf collecting dust. This took blood, sweat, and tears to make it to us and be preserved. Of course, Allah promised this. Allah's promise is going to be fulfilled, but the promise doesn't mean that it was an easy path, right? And it needed decisions to be made, and we'll talk about those decisions. Okay. All right. So the transmission of the Quran is unique to the Quran. Okay? And it's peculiar to Islamic history, for no other religious book can claim to be anywhere near as authentic as the Quran. Nothing. Nothing can claim to be as authentic as the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, number one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has taken it upon himself to guard and protect the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, it is certainly we who have revealed the dhikr, the reminder, i.e. the Quran, and it will be us who will preserve it. Now we talked about it before, Allah's promising it will be preserved. Allah's promises are always fulfilled. Right? How does that work? Is there something that is kind of hovering around the Quran and nobody's able to touch it and change it? No, it's preserved through, we talked about this, through? So I can't hear. Oral and written, but what is the means? People, right? People are the means to protect it, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used, and this is why we started maybe the first class, so maybe some of you didn't join. We mentioned the hadith that The special people of Allah are the people of the Quran, right? Ahlul Quran hum ahlullahi wa khassatuh. That the people of the Quran are the people of Allah and His special people. And those are the people that protect the Quran. By the way, it's not just the memorization of the Quran, it's everything we're covering. Its meanings, its explanations, the Mecki versus Madani, how it was preserved, how it was revealed. All of that knowledge within Uloom al-Quran is part of preserving the Quran. And so anybody who partakes in that, inshallah ta'ala, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to be of those people, are the people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His special people. Okay. Also, when the Prophet ﷺ was fearful for forgetting, because we talked about this last week, right? When we talked about how do we know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا تحرك به لسانك لتعجل به. Right? Do not rush your tongue to try to memorize. إِنَّ عَلَيْنَا جَمْعَهُ وَقُرْآنَهُ. It is certainly upon us to make you memorize it and recite it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the Prophet, you're not going to forget it. You're not going to forget it. That's a guarantee from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the Quran and says, إِنَّهُ لَكِتَابٌ عَزِيزٌ لا يأتيه الباطل من بين يديه ولا من خلفه تنزيل من حكيم حميد. It is truly a mighty book. It cannot be proven false from any angle. It is a revelation from the all-wise, praiseworthy. Okay? Now the Quran's transmission, as mentioned by Hamza, there are two ways that was transmitted. There's oral and written. Today we'll cover the oral, inshallah, and the written we'll cover next week, inshallah ta'ala. Okay? And the oral is fairly straightforward. The revelation of the Quran was transmitted to us by numerous amount of people, both in written and oral and written. When it came to oral, it's through memorization from the Prophet, directly from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, رَسُولٌ مِّنَ اللَّهِ يَتْلُو صُحُفًا مُطَهَّرًا. That a messenger from Allah reciting scrolls of utmost purity. Okay? That it's pure, it has no defects, no contradictions, and it will always be pure. Okay? I apologize for the formatting. I think this is again the formatting issue. Shouldn't be like that when it comes to the PDF. I don't think, I'll read that out inshallah. So, the Prophet ﷺ declared the revelation. This is how it worked. The Prophet ﷺ would get the revelation. We talked about different ways last week. And he, ﷺ, would receive it from Jibreel ﷺ, right? And so the Prophet ﷺ would recite it to Jibreel on a regular basis. And especially in Quran, in Ramadan, he would recite it, ﷺ, everything that was revealed to him, he would recite in its completeness to Jibreel ﷺ as a form of review. In the last year, ﷺ, he did it twice, in his last Ramadan, correct. Okay? And Jibreel would also recite it back to the Prophet ﷺ, right? So, some people might think it was just one-time revelation, done. Yes, even if it was the case, Allah said He's going to preserve it, but there was a process of preservation with the Prophet ﷺ. Fatima radiallahu anha reported that the Prophet ﷺ confided in her, and he said, Jibreel used to recite the whole Quran to me every Ramadan, but this year, his last year, he recited it twice. And he said, I do not see any explanation for this, except that my time of death is near. So the Prophet ﷺ took it as a sign that his time is coming. So the Prophet ﷺ would receive the revelation and he would declare it and instruct the companions to memorize it. And this is now the beginning of the oral transmission. Okay? So for example, Abdullah bin Mas'ud radiallahu anhu was the first man to publicly recite the Quran in Mecca. We know that. In the early days, the Sahaba knew the Quran. They were memorizing it as it was revealed to them, as it was communicated to them. And this was during the early time of Mecca. How do we know? Because when Ibn Mas'ud went to Maqam Ibrahim in front of the Kaaba and he started to recite Surah Al-Rahman. Al-Rahman allama al-Quran, khalaqa al-insan allamahu al-bayan. And he raised his voice, radiallahu anhu, when he did it. People got up and started to beat him up because they heard him reading it out loud, and they said, he's one of them, and they started to harm him. It is also reported that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu used to recite the Quran publicly in front of his house in Mecca, so there's evidence that the Sahaba are memorizing it as it was being taught to them directly. Okay? There are also numerous ahadith giving account to efforts made and measures taken by the Prophet ﷺ to ensure that it was in the memory of the Sahaba. And what's not appearing here is this ayah, this hadith, which I'll just read off. خيركم من تعلم القرآن وعلمه. The Prophet ﷺ said, the best of you are those who learn the Quran and teach it. And this is in Sahih Bukhari, this hadith. So we know that the Quran recital was recited regularly during prayers. The night prayer, by the way, in Mecca was an obligation until that obligation was removed, right? This is before the 5 prayers, right? Certainly the 5 prayers. When were they made obligation? Mecca or Medina? Mecca, right? Isra and Mi'raj was during Mecca, right? End of the Mecca, closer to the end of the Meccan period. But even before that, there was salah. It wasn't like there's no salah before. No, they actually, the night prayer in Surah Al-Muzammil, the obligation to pray the night prayer was lifted in the last ayah of Surah Al-Muzammil. But it was, so they were reciting it out loud while they were praying, and that's how we knew they knew it as well. The Prophet ﷺ also enjoyed listening to the Quran from different Sahaba. We know the hadith of Abdullah bin Mas'ud radiallahu anh. The Prophet ﷺ told him or asked him to read from Surah An-Nisa. And he responded, so the Prophet said, recite from the Quran for me. And Abdullah bin Mas'ud radiallahu anh said, shall I recite to you even though it was revealed on you, O Prophet of Allah? And the Prophet said, I like to hear the Quran from others. So Abdullah bin Mas'ud started to recite from Surah An-Nisa until he reached فَكَيْفَ إِذَا جِئْنَا مِنْ كُلِّ أُمَّةٍ بِشَهِيدٍ وَجِئْنَا بِكَ عَلَى هَؤُلَاءِ شَهِيدًا. Okay? And the Prophet told him stop, and he looked at the Prophet ﷺ, and he saw him crying from the responsibility that he was reminded of. So we knew that the Sahaba were memorizing it in real time, and not only that, but they were also teaching it at the same time. So it wasn't like a one-way road where the Prophet ﷺ would recite it to the Sahaba, they'd learn it, okay, we're done. No, they were teaching it to each other. The Prophet ﷺ did not sit with every single believer in Mecca and teach them the Quran one-on-one. Rasulullah didn't have the time, and that's not the most efficient and effective way anyways, and that's not how the Quran should be transmitted from one person to everybody. It was a silsila, it was a chain. So the Sahaba that learned it from the Prophet ﷺ, in Mecca, they would gather together and they would communicate and teach the Quran. For example, in Dar al-Arqam, right? Where the Prophet ﷺ would teach them and then they would teach it to other Sahaba as well. Okay? We know that the Prophet ﷺ instructed people to learn the Quran from specific people. And we mentioned this hadith before, that the Prophet ﷺ says, خذوا القرآن من أربعة من عبد الله بن مسعود وسالم مولى أبي حذيفة ومعاذ بن جبل وأبي بن كعب. So take the Quran from these 4 people, and he mentioned them, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, meaning that they were learning it as it was being revealed or taught to them from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And there's another hadith where the Prophet says, خُذُوا الْقُرْآنَ مِنْ أَرْبَعَةٍ, and then it specifies 4 other Sahaba. Take the Quran from 4 other Sahaba, and he mentions Abdullah bin Mas'ud, Salim, Mu'adh bin Jabal, and Ubay bin Ka'b. So some overlap there. There are historical reports, and the memorization was again continued after the Prophet's death. So that's the oral transmission of the Quran. And I think we'll probably, yeah, it's been an hour and 10 minutes, well, an hour and 5 minutes or so. So what we'll do, inshallah, instead of starting a new topic, we'll pause here. Does anybody have any question when it comes to transmitting the Quran orally? Yes.
So just to recap, so then the Prophet ﷺ would get the revelation from Jibreel alayhi salam, then he would recite it out loud, and then the people around him would memorize it, or they'd try to write it down on what they have,
Yeah.
and then they would recite it to each other.
Yeah, so we didn't talk about the writing because that's next week. The transmission now we're talking about is oral, and then there's also the written. And they, by the way, you're right, they go hand in hand, right? So we shouldn't treat them separately, but I don't have the time to finish everything in one, so I just do that. I did the oral. But essentially, and we'll talk more about this next week, is when the Prophet ﷺ would receive revelation, he would call his scribes. And we'll talk about who those scribes are, inshallah, next week. And he would, ﷺ, recite it to them, and he would order them to write it down. And then after they would write it down, he, ﷺ, would tell them, recite it back to me to make sure you wrote it down properly. And so they would recite it back to him based on what they wrote, and then they would go and memorize it and teach it to other people.
How would we know if this is, for example, in the middle of Surah Baqarah versus, because they would, not everything would come down all at once.
The Prophet later on started to order the Quran in a specific order based on Jibreel, based on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes, good questions. Any other questions about the oral transmission? Oral transmission is easier to talk about because really it's memorization, right? And there are key Sahaba that memorized, and the Prophet told us, instructed us, take it from these Sahaba, which the Sahaba did. And those were essentially, again, we'll talk about, so maybe I'll mention this quickly instead of waiting until next week. So when the Prophet ﷺ passed away, we said roughly how many days between the last revelation of the Quran and when his time came, ﷺ. How many days? About 9, okay? Now, at his time, ﷺ, because there's only 9 days, right, after the final revelation, there was about 25 Sahaba that had memorized everything by the time he passed away, ﷺ. Okay? Of course, there were more Sahaba that also memorized, but not everything, right? And you could say, well, why isn't it more than 25 or so, based on the scholars? It's because there's only 9 days after the last revelation came, and then he passed away, ﷺ. So, but we know that at the time of the Sahaba, right after the Prophet ﷺ, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of Sahaba that memorized it within a very short period, within those first 2 years, actually, of Abu Bakr's Khilafah. How do we know that? Because next week we'll talk about the Battle of Yamama, okay? When a lot of the believers that were killed in that battle were memorizers of the Quran, about 700 of them. And that's what triggered, a lot of the memorizers are passing away or being killed. How are we going to preserve the Quran if it's all in the minds of people? We need to preserve it and with the written form. And that's what triggered now the process of transmission in written form. Okay? But yes, there was a lot of care in the memorization. And they were, again, it's constantly reciting it, right? Even when you talk about the Prophet ﷺ, when he was giving sermons, okay? He would, for example, ﷺ, in a lot of sermons, he would recite from Surah Qaf, to the point where it was so much. We hear, for example, the Imam in Salat al-Jum'ah, right? How do they usually end the Salah? Inna Allah ya'muru bil-adli wal-ihsan. We've all memorized it because it's said every single week, right? Same thing with the Sahaba. The Prophet ﷺ would say, for example, from Surah Qaf, the Sahabiyat memorized it simply by how often he ﷺ would recite ayat. Again, the Prophet ﷺ didn't just recite ayat once, right? It's not just, here are the ayat revealed to me. Here, I've said them. Okay, we're never going to talk about. No. They were regularly recited throughout, right? And if come to the masjid and see how often the Quran was being recited and multiply that by 100. That's the frequency of the Quran being recited at the time of the Prophet ﷺ is nowhere near where we recite it today. It's a lot more, right? And so with repetition, everybody, the believers who were there were memorizing it. It was natural to memorize, right? You didn't have to actually, oh, I have Hifz class today, I got a review. No, this is part of their mini society at the time. Does that make sense?
The organization of the ayat, did that happen as it was coming down or later on?
Let's talk about that later, inshallah, because we'll talk about all of that, inshallah ta'ala. Yes. Very good. So it's almost 9:45. We'll end with what everyone's waiting for, the exciting assignment, our first assignment of the class. This assignment is mandatory for credit students. If you're an audit student and you just simply want to do it just to make sure you're engaging in the class, you're learning, you're more than welcome to. You don't have to submit it, or you can submit it just for our feedback. It's up to you. I think it's worth part of your learning, so that you make sure, inshallah, that you hold yourself accountable. The assignment's fairly straightforward. The table has different themes, and the assignment requires that you pick any 4 themes, any 4 topics, and describe the emphasis of each theme in Mecca versus Medina. I kind of give an example in the slides, if you remember. For instance, the non-Muslims. In Mecca, it was mainly disbelievers or mushrikeen, and in Medina, it was people of the book or hypocrites, right? So similarly, pick 4 topics and provide a single or a group of ayat for each period that supports your answer for Mecca versus Medina. And if the approach changed, and for these topics they should have changed, how is that approach changed? So explain that shift. And please make sure you use tafasir. They're widely available online. Ibn Kathir is fully translated, I think, online in English if you don't want to use Arabic references. There are tafasir in English you can use to support your response. And here's the rubric of what distinguishes incomplete versus needs improvement versus good versus excellent in terms of accuracy of the theme description, the Quranic evidence, the analysis, and the presentation. Basically how you're organizing the information. Yes? Yes, it'll be graded for credit students. Should they be? Yes, of course. Don't give me wrong answers. Yeah, this is why you have to consult tafasir, right? And you can look up topics. By the way, there's a lot of resources online, and even some maybe here. There's masahif, we'll talk about this later too, inshallah, that are actually organized by theme. They're actually color-coded by theme. So you can just look up these themes and look at these colors and read and get just an example of ayat that are from a Meccan surah versus Madani surah. And then you can look at the analysis. It's going to be clear, right? It's not going to be something that requires necessarily a high level of scholarship, right? How, when it comes to social justice or it comes to dealing with oppression, right? For example, how do you deal with oppression? In Mecca and Medina, it's clear. So you can comment on that change, inshallah ta'ala. And this will give a due date of, let's give it 2 weeks. So it will be, so you have ample time. So today's the 9th, inshallah, on the 23rd. So not next Thursday, but the Thursday after, inshallah. And you can submit those online. Or if you want to print them and give them to me, hard copy, that works too. Yes?
Could you expand more on what does it mean to describe that theme?
So how is the theme emphasized in Mecca versus Medina? Just how is it addressed, right? So, for example, I don't want to take away from some of these topics, but if we talk about prohibitions, right? The prohibitions of shirk and murder and adultery, right? In Mecca. In Medina, it's alcohol, gambling, right? What's the difference between those? Okay. Any other questions, inshallah? So we'll close, inshallah, give you guys time to get home inshallah before 10. جزاكم الله خير سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. And if you haven't